Welcome to today's presentation. When you are born to breathe free, we're going to be talking about the respiratory system, which is extremely critical because while we often think of nutrition as, one of the most important things for health, of course, one of the things that you need more than anything else is oxygen. Oxygen is the breath of life, and while we can live for weeks without food and maybe a few days without water, we can only live minutes without oxygen. So I want to talk a little bit about the importance of oxygen and what happens with the interaction between human beings and plants. Plants basically absorb water, and then they have a respiratory system of sorts too, where they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they use the energy of the sun then to strip the carbon free from the carbon dioxide and attach it to the water to create a carbohydrate. Carbon hydrated, get it? Okay. Carbohydrates are sugars and starches and so forth, and then they exhale oxygen. Well, we do the reverse. We inhale the oxygen and we eat the carbohydrates created by the plants, and then we oxidize or split apart the carbon from the carbohydrate, which yields the energy that was captured from the sun by the plant, and the byproduct of that is we produce water and exhale carbon dioxide. So the respiratory system is obviously a really critical factor in this whole thing of energy production, because the respiratory system is how we get the oxygen into our system and how we get the carbon dioxide out of our system. Well, we are having a problem in the world, especially in cities and industrialized areas, where we're starting to have oxygen deprivation because of the many environmental contaminants that have been dumped into our atmosphere over the last 50 years. The oxygen levels in some major cities have been reduced to 21.89% to under 10%. And I know in the United States, where I live, you're not supposed to have less than 18-19% oxygen inside of a building in the ventilation system. So that means that people are just not getting enough oxygen, and this is causing problems with the respiratory system. So let's take a look at this respiratory system and examine the structure and a little bit about the function of the lungs. So obviously we have, the sinuses aren't depicted on this particular slide, but the sinuses contain little hairs that are there to trap pollen and dust and other material to keep that from getting into our lungs. And then the air from either the mouth or the sinuses ideally goes down into the tube at the back of our throat and then breaks off into the trachea or the windpipe. There's a little flap there to keep food out of the windpipe, so it opens up when you breathe and closes down when you're swallowing. And then the trachea goes down into the bronchioles, which are the bigger tubes that go into the lungs, and then those break down into the bronchus, the smaller passages, and then basically they finally go down into these little alveoli, which are little sacs that are like teeny little balloons that can inflate and deflate. They have kind of an elasticity, so they fill up with air, and they're surrounded by blood capillaries where the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place. Now the whole system is operated by the diaphragm muscle, which is a great big muscle that separates the chest cavity from the abdominal cavity, and the diaphragm pulls down to inflate the lung like bellows, and we'll see that in just a moment. Now, you have a thing called the lifestyle analysis, which is designed to kind of point to the potential problems that people might have with this particular system. One of them being bad breath. The reason why the red meat is on there is because many times people who are eating very heavy diets in protein have a little more tendency to congestion. Food allergies often contribute towards respiratory congestion. Smoking, including if you are working around people or living with someone who's smoking, that's really harmful to the lungs. The particulate matter from the smoke is damaging to the lung tissue, and also is again depriving your body of oxygen. Dairy products are also known to be heavy mucus producers, and a lot of times people who have heavy mucus production are also having problems with digesting dairy properly, or maybe even have some dairy allergies. Energy production, of course, is really big with the respiratory system. If you're lacking energy, get tired easily, that can be due to not getting a good exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the lungs. The problem of air pollution, which we talked about. If you live in any major metropolitan area, you're having to work a little bit more with the lungs because of the pollutants that are being inhaled and the lower level of oxygen. And of course, if you have congestion or anything like that. There's two things that are not on the lifestyle analysis, which you might want to ask people about if you are suspecting that they might need help with the respiratory system. One is if they're shallow breathers, just have the person take a deep breath, and if they breathe up into their chest, then their diaphragm muscle is not moving very well. Their belly should inflate slightly or protrude out slightly as they inhale and collapse back in as they exhale. And many adults have problems where they aren't breathing correctly from their diaphragm, so they're not getting enough air into their lungs to create good oxygen carbon dioxide exchange. And the other thing to look for, which is a good indicator of a tendency to congestion, is if their tongue is very heavily coated, has a very heavy mucus coat on it. Now, I mentioned this thing about the diaphragm. The diaphragm, you see, moves downward, which acts like a bellows that causes the lungs to basically inflate and suck the air into the lungs. And then, as the diaphragm relaxes back upward, the air is pushed out of the lungs, kind of like the air gets pushed out of a balloon, because there's a little bit of elasticity in the tissue of the lungs. So as the diaphragm pulls down, it sucks the air in, and as the diaphragm releases, the air just kind of naturally gets pushed out. Again, the belly should rise on the inhale and fall on the exhale. If you watch a little baby breathe while they're sleeping, or a small healthy child, you'll notice their tummy rising and falling slightly with each breath. That's the normal way to breathe. And many adults, especially adults who have a lot of chronic health problems, are shallow breathers. They're not getting the oxygen from their diaphragm, and they need to really work on loosening up the diaphragm. Sometimes it helps to kind of just massage up around under the rib cage and kind of massage down and kind of work that area to relax it, and then just practice inhaling deeply, trying to push the stomach out as you inhale, and as you exhale, suck the stomach back in and try to push as much air out of your lungs as you possibly can. And that really helps to exercise and train the diaphragm, and you wind up getting a lot more oxygen. Learning to breathe this way is really a very big contributor to just general overall health. It has a lot of both physical and mental and emotional benefits. First of all, when you breathe deeply from your abdomen, you're going to increase oxygen levels in your body, which is going to enhance your energy production. You're going to feel more energized, more alive, more alert. It also helps to relax muscle tension in your body. This has an alkalizing effect on the body. Basically, acid and alkaline have to do with the amount of electrons available for energy in the body. So alkaline solutions have electrons to donate to chemical reactions. Acidic substances are lacking electrons and steal electrons. It's really very similar to the whole idea of free radicals and antioxidants. But basically, the more your body needs to have a slightly alkaline pH to have a good high energy level, and as we get weaker and our health just starts to deteriorate, we tend to get more acid. And so deep breathing is one of the ways in which we can help to re-energize and re-alkalize the body. Deep breathing is very calming to the nerves, so if you have a tendency to be nervous and kind of high-strung, learning to breathe deeply can help you to relax and calm down your nerves. Plus, it pumps the lymphatic system. The movement of the chest cavity compresses the thoracic duct, which is the major duct in the lymph system, and dramatically increases lymph movement, which helps your body detoxify, pulling fluid and protein and debris away from the cells to be cleaned up. The mental and emotional benefits are that it's stress reducing. Anytime you find yourself getting stressed or wigged out, one of the things, if you just stop and take a few deep breaths, you'll notice that you tend to feel a little less stressed, a little more calm. Deep breathing helps to keep your emotions centered, so you're less emotionally volatile. You feel more calm and peaceful. And it's also grounding, helps you feel kind of solid and connected and not flighty and easy to push around. People who breathe up into their chest are more easily stressed out and also kind of pushed around by life, whereas the more you learn to breathe deeply from your abdomen, the more you feel calm, centered, relaxed, grounded, and the more stable you feel. Another really critical thing that is very, very important for the health of your lungs is to stay properly hydrated. Your lungs are coated with mucus. They're mucous membranes. Also, your sinuses are. And there are little hair-like projections called cilia that line the lungs and sinuses. That basically the mucus traps the dust and the pollen and the particulate matter, and then the cilia sweep it to the back of the throat in the case of the sinuses, or to the top of the lungs in the case of the lungs, and you swallow it, like when you clear your throat. Okay, that's the mucus moving up to basically clear debris out of your lungs. So mucus is 95% water. So even slight dehydration will basically make mucus thicker and tend to cause you to be congested. Mucus is also has a little bit of salt in it. So basically, you want to make sure that you drink an adequate amount of water and take a little bit of salt to basically increase mucus flow. Now, I live in a very hot, dry climate, and I have a garden, and it can get really dusty. And I was really having very, very bad reactions with getting congested from the dust out in the garden. It would irritate my sinuses, and I would have itchy eyes and feel really bad. And then I learned to basically drink lots and lots of water and take salt with it, some kind of natural salt. And basically what that does is it creates more mucus, more tears to help flush the irritants out so that you're actually helping to keep the lungs clean and the membranes get less irritated. So just water with a little bit of salt makes an excellent expectorant and decongestant. Now, in Chinese medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, it's interesting that the colon and the lungs are considered to be related with what's called the metal element, which is basically the element or the energy of our bodies that allows us to defend ourselves. Really, the skin and the mucous membranes lining both the lungs and the digestive tract are like the outer surface of the body. They're like the perimeter of defense to basically protect the body against things being able to get into the body that shouldn't be in the body. Well, there's a strong link between the health of your digestion and your digestive tract and the health of your lungs. I had chronic sinus problems when I was growing up, a lot of respiratory weakness, and it was actually working on my digestive tract that really did the most good in terms of getting my sinus problems and everything to clear up and help me to learn to breathe freely. Now, in traditional Chinese medicine, spicy foods, pungent tasting foods, are considered to tonify the metal qi. In other words, to increase the energy of the metal element or the defensive energy of the body. And if you think of this as sort of like the shields, energy pushing away from the surface of the skin and the membranes to basically keep irritants from irritating our digestive tract, our lungs, and our skin, then think of what happens when you eat spicy food. If you go out and have a nice Indian curry and you have it really hot, You'll probably notice that you clear your throat a little bit. You might get a little bit of sinus drainage. You might get a little bit of perspiration forming if it's really, really hot. That increase in the mucus production and that increase in sweat is what we're talking about. It's the energy moving to the surfaces of the body to help flush the surfaces of the body to basically help do that. I found that one of the best things I can do when I feel like I'm starting to get a little congested is just to get any kind of spicy, warming food or herbs and take that with plenty of water. So things like garlic and onions, chili peppers or capsicum, cayenne pepper, horseradish, thyme, rosemary, oregano, all of these things are really good for increasing what the Chinese would call the metal qi. There's also, a Western concept, a similar Western concept of the phlegmatic or water constitution, which is thought to have too much phlegm or mucus. And this personality has a hard time standing up for themselves. In other words, they tend to be more compliant and passive and so forth, and less assertive and aggressive. So again, there's this relationship between how we defend ourselves and this respiratory system. And in both traditional Chinese medicine and traditional Western medicine, excessive grief and sadness are thought to bring about respiratory problems. And I have seen people who have, after they've lost loved ones or so forth, who have not engaged the grieving process and therefore wind up having respiratory problems from not dealing with the grief. So here are some other general things you can do to keep the lungs healthy. One, don't smoke. That's probably one of the worst things you can do for your lungs. If you live in a major metropolitan area, you may want to do something to filter or try to clean your air. And one of the things that's really good at that is houseplants. Houseplants have been shown to absorb toxins in the air, and also they're going to increase oxygen because they're going to add more oxygen to the air. So I definitely consider getting some plants. I keep houseplants in my house, even though I live out in the country. Avoid inhaling chemicals. A lot of the fumes from cleaning products and so forth can be really harmful to the lungs. I know people who have cleaned homes for a living who had respiratory problems because they were using these toxic cleaning products. And when they switched to more natural cleaning products, they quit having respiratory problems. So that's another thing to consider. Are you being exposed to any fumes of chemicals? Don't suppress mucus production and expulsion. A lot of over-the-counter cold and flu remedies and so forth are designed actually to dry up mucus secretions and suppress them. That's not the way to have healthy lungs, because this is a natural mechanism for cleaning the lungs. If you're getting congestion, you don't want to suppress that. You want to instead encourage it to be a healthy mucus production, thinning out the mucus with the water and getting the herbs in there that are going to help stimulate the expulsion of the mucus so that you keep going. And remember that there's a big link between your digestion and your lungs. So if you're having respiratory problems, really look, are you getting good digestion? Do you need enzymes or so forth to help keep your digestion going? Now, we're going to wrap this up by talking about how herbs work on the respiratory system. And basically, when you're trying to deal with respiratory problems, it's really important to look at the terrain of the respiratory tract, because the right herbs that are going to help this are the ones that are going to balance out what's going on in the tissues of your body. So dampness would be too much mucus. So if you have a lot of mucus, a lot of heavy mucus, the best way to deal with that is to take pungent or bitter herbs, because they're drying. Now, pungent herbs are warming and drying, and bitter herbs are cooling and drying. So it's going to depend on whether it's hot or cold, whether you choose the pungents or the bitters. Now, if it's dry, then you're not getting enough mucus production. So if you have a dry, hacking cough, dry, scratchy throat, and you're got respiratory problems, but you're not getting mucus coming up, then you need mucilent or mucilaginous or demulcent herbs, or herbs that have a little bit of a salty flavor. Because remember that salt, which is the minerals, are real important for mucus production. Now you can use natural salt, but there are also herbs like mullein, for example, that are considered salty, which also help to moisten or hydrate the lungs when used with water, of course. And then you want to also assess whether the lungs are kind of cold or underactive, which is when you have clear or white mucus, and that's when you use the pungent or spicy herbs because they're warming. And if the hot mucus is considered to be yellowish or greenish, and that's when you use the bitters. So we have this wonderful formula called Fenugreek and Fennel, and this herbal combination was formulated by an herbalist named Jeannie Burgess, who lived in the Pacific Northwest. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Pacific Northwest, but especially during the winter months, it's really cold, not super cold, but it's cold and it's really damp. And so this Fenugreek and Fennel formula is really composed of warming and drying herbs. So it's basically designed for a cold, damp respiratory terrain, but it also has enough cooling action that it can also be used when there's a hot, damp terrain. In other words, when the mucus is a little bit discolored, but it's basically for the excess mucus, when you're getting congested and there's too much mucus. It's got fenugreek, which is an aromatic that is kind of warming and a little bit moistening. It's got fennel, which is aromatic, warming, and helps to loosen mucus. It's got horseradish, which is a nice pungent spice that's warming and drying, and boneset, which is a little bitter and drying, so that gives it a little bit of cooling thing, and mullein, which is the salty and a little bit moistening. So I find this works really well when you get that damp, cold weather and people are having respiratory problems. I know when I lived in northern Utah, there's a lake up there, and you get these inversions and this foggy, smoggy thing. Freaking fennel really helped people who had those kinds of lung problems that were happening when that cold, damp weather was around. Now, since I moved down to southern Utah, which is a desert, and it's very hot and very dry here, the fenugreek and fennel combination has not come up as being as needed by more people because their lungs are already so dry. So this is really best when you have a lot of congestion. I want to mention also that this formula is a good digestive aid. It actually does help to stimulate better digestion and help the digestive tract. And that was one of the things that Jeannie Burgess was looking at when she formulated the formula, because she knew that the problems with the digestive system contributed to problems with the respiratory system. So I've seen this be very helpful when people tend to get congested from, say, eating wheat or dairy or other foods that tend to, many people, cause kind of a mucus reaction, that the fenugreek and fennel formula can kind of calm that down and help them digest those foods better, which leads to less congestion. So it's a very, very excellent formula, and one that I have used a lot. I know when Nature Sunshine introduced it, it shot right up to bestsellers within a few months, and it stayed there as a top seller ever since because it is so effective. Now, obviously, the fenugreek and fennel does not work for everything. So let's look at a few other things that we can get from Nature Sunshine can help with the respiratory system. There's also fenugreek and thyme. The fenugreek and fennel really works best in the lungs. It can be somewhat helpful for the sinus stuff too, but it really works on the lungs. Whereas the fenugreek and thyme, while it works on the lungs, is a little bit better for the sinuses. This is aromatic, warming, and moistening, so it is going to be used primarily when there's excess mucus or dampness, and the mucus is white or runny and clear, although it can be a little bit helpful when it's when the mucus is hot, when it gets a little bit discolored. But it's primarily for the thin or white mucus, excessive up in the sinuses. It also helps to just kind of decongest the sinuses or help clear them out because it stimulates that flow of blood and energy into the sinuses, which helps create more mucus production to help the sinuses work better at flushing irritants away. I really love garlic as a remedy for the lungs. When garlic is crushed, an enzyme called allanase causes allan to form into allicin. And allicin is this compound that really helps to, it has antimicrobial properties, but it degrades rather rapidly. So once you like dry or powder or whatever garlic, it doesn't have that activity. It's only either fresh garlic or something where that allicin has been stabilized, as in the case of high potency garlic, that you really get the benefit. So when allicin gets ingested into the body and gets into the bloodstream, it's excreted through the lungs, which is why you can smell garlic on your breath after you've eaten it. So this is really useful when you've got a lot of dampness in the lungs and it's kind of that cold or underactive condition. And that works really, really well with the fenugreek and fennel. I've used the two together many times where the really cold, damp conditions in the lungs. The general amount that you want to use here is about 4 capsules of the fenugreek fennel with 1 tablet of the high potency garlic. And you want to do that every 2 to 4 hours with lots of water because you want to keep the lungs well hydrated. One time I was up in northern Utah and we had one of those temperature inversions where it was really smoggy and foggy for several weeks. Had lots of people with lung problems. I had it for a few days and I thought, I'm really tired of this. And so I took the fenugreek fennel and garlic. I actually used raw garlic because didn't have the high potency garlic at that time. But I took a clove of garlic and 4 fenugreek fennel every 2 hours. And by the end of the day, I was perfectly fine and knew people who battled that, respiratory stuff for 2 weeks. So fabulous. Now, if you have a more of a dry condition of the lungs, like the dry hacking cough or dry scratchy throat or whatever, or a person who's been smoking a long time and they're starting to get wheezy because their lungs are losing moisture and elasticity because the smoke dries out your lungs, then you need something more moistening. And you can still use the fenugreek and fennel, but you want to add to it more moistening herbs. So take it with some mullein. Mullein is a very slow-acting remedy, but it really helps to hydrate the lungs. It has a flavor that herbalists call salty. It's not really like table salt, but it has just kind of a grassy taste, which is a sign of minerals in it. And these herbs tend to be very moistening. So about 4 to 6 capsules of mullein per day, taken over several months, can really help to hydrate and nourish the lungs. And you can take that with a smaller amount of fenugreek and fennel. So like you could take 2 fenugreek and fennel and 2 mullein, and that would be really beneficial. You could also add slippery elm. Slippery elm is also very soothing and moistening and helps, again, to get more hydration in the lungs. Now, one other remedy that I really love is the Taifu massage lotion. Of course, I use that, to rub into muscles, or my neck gets sore from working at computers. It's great, but it's also great when I'm feeling just starting to get a little bit congested. You just rub some of that into your chest, and then you're inhaling those wonderful essential oils that have stimulating properties to help the mucus move out of the sinuses and lungs. There's also a little bit of a disinfectant action in essential oils. So really, really good. Also brings the circulation into the chest to help the body get the blood and nutrients and the white blood cells and everything in there to help the body to function properly. So that's another great thing that you can use for the respiratory system. So depending on what the terrain is, you have a number of options that you can use to help people who need support for the respiratory system. So please use this information to help yourself and also to help others. Thank you for listening to today's presentation.